Good afternoon, good day. Welcome to this very important webinar on inclusive education at the global and national levels in Russia. I want to begin by just making some housekeeping notes. So please make sure you are on the correct audio channel by pressing the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a little globe, and selecting English or Russian. If you are hearing the audio in your preferred language at the moment, we will be giving the presentation in both languages during this meeting, so you will need to be on the right channel to hear the translation at some point. Subtitles are available in English. To view them, click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. You can view the full transcript by clicking on the link shared in the chat box right now. Please keep your microphone and camera off during the presentations so you do not distract from the presentations. We may mute you if we hear any feedback or background noise from you. If you require technical assistance, you can raise your hand or write in the chat box, and our team will be happy to help you. Nancy and Vlad are here for technical support in English and Russian. We have a dedicated question and answer sessions throughout today's workshop. To ask a question, you can raise your hand, type in the chat box, or simply unmute yourself and ask your question. We are recording today's session. Please only turn on your camera or microphone if you consent to be recorded. Our session in the next 3 days is intended in this workshop to serve several purposes. My name is Sue Swenson. I am president of Inclusion International. I raised a son with profound disabilities who was included in school in the United States. I had to fight for it. Got involved in organizational work, as many of the people on this call are. Served the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Education and Rehab Services. That is the Ministry for Special Education for 7.5 years. And I am now president of Inclusion International, as I said, and very happy to be here with you. Inclusion International is an international network that unites people with developmental and intellectual disabilities and their families. We promote the protection of the rights of people with intellectual disabilities around the world. Today, our organization is represented by more than 200 member federations in 115 countries in 5 regions, including the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Africa, America, and the Asia Pacific region. Our Catalyst for Inclusive Education is an initiative of Inclusion International created to increase the inclusiveness of education for children with intellectual disabilities through our members around the world. Our purpose for this workshop today is first to get acquainted with different scenarios of inclusive education for children with disabilities and their families in Russia, and identify key challenges in the implementation of inclusive education. 2, to agree on the definition of inclusion in Russia for civil society. 3, to study the role of international standards and mechanisms in achieving inclusive education in Russia. And 4, contribute to the preparation of conclusions and recommendations for key stakeholders in order to increase inclusion for education for children with disabilities in Russia. To open today, I would like to ask Denise Rosa to make a few remarks. And Denise, if you would like to start, thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. Сначала Я хочу делать небольшое объявление.
Begin with, I would like to make an announcement. Well, unfortunately, the head of the Department of Rights of Children under the Ministry of Education, Lady Stefanovna, not able to participate in person, but she said that she is with us in her mind and heart. She gave me a call apologizing, and she will do her best at least to stay connected, to listen or broadcast. But I hope that the third day that we will have a representative from the Ministry of Education with us, and because we are very important to hear about the Russian experience and also about the strategy of education development. My name is Denis Rosa, and I know some of you and may not know some others, but I'm very happy that this event is taking place today, and it will go for 3 days. Perspectiva public organization and that was set up more than 23 years ago. Actually, we'll aim to celebrate 24 years of our existence. And one of the first tasks that we saw, objectives that we pursued, is to bring people with different forms of a disability under our umbrella. So about a decade ago, we started to engage in the theme of inclusive education, to give more support to children, for them, to give better environment for them to develop and to enjoy equal rights with others. And you may imagine that 15 years ago, that was a true challenge. The situation was very different when we just first went to schools in Moscow, and together with our partners from different regions, my colleagues and I, members of my team, were the first people with disabilities in schools. They gave the lessons of kindness, and that was a completely new page in their lives, both in the lives of teachers and students. At that time, efforts to engage in inclusive education were very shy. But over this period, much has been done, and many changes have happened. And the attitude to people with disability is changing. And that's relevant not only to teachers, but also for parents of kids with disabilities, and parents of kids with no disability. Well, there are challenges, there are hurdles, challenges that many of you are aware. And I can say from my personal experience that the challenges are many. We have been working shoulder to shoulder with public organizations, with also different offices, schools, with the Ministry of Education, and it's extremely important for us to develop dialogue, to be in contact with different organizations and stakeholders, because things should be done in different areas. The development of a dialogue is important, and it should go in parallel with raising awareness of people at different levels. And also studies were launched, and also through lawsuits, when we find out that there are some legal challenges, well, if necessary, we file a lawsuit. If not, we just provide a legal advice to those who need it. There were cases when children with disability, with special educational needs, should get access to equal equal access, fair access to education to develop their potential. A coalition of public organizations of parents of children with disabilities and people with disabilities. The coalition together over 20 cities, and will hear from their experience, from their partners at schools, and that's a very important practical experience of what is going on in different regions of Russia. We also organize, and one of the reasons why we work together with Inclusion International to convene this event is to understand how important it is to stay in touch, or how important it is to hear the voices of experts, of public organizations, on other entities to exchange experience. That's why we invited so many excellent experts to share their experience and to say, to tell us about things that are being developed and taking place in different countries. Inclusion 24 is the platform that we have, and we are developing it more and more actively. So it would be good to hear your voice and your opinion on what you need. Well, we have 3 days ahead. We encourage you to be active participants, to invite your colleagues to join us if you believe that they are those who need to be with us. That's why after each event,
Там в конце, все-таки мы оставляем время для того, чтобы было
but at the end of the day, we will leave space for active discussion, and we encourage you not to be shy and to contribute to the discussion. I find it difficult to speak. That's a very exciting moment for me. I hope that things will go well, and that will be a full 3-day event for all of us that will be of importance for us. We understand that things will not change in a split second on Friday, but nevertheless, that will give us impetus to move forward, to develop this area of work. And maybe this event will help you as well find co-thinkers in other regions, in other countries that will help you to move forward in your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I have had the pleasure of being in Russia twice, both under sponsorship from Denise. Certainly changed my advocacy. The people I met were very wise and had very important ideas to share. And I would agree with Denise, it's very important for us to take today to listen to each other and share ideas with each other. It certainly did change the way I approached advocacy. I only want to make one comment, and that is this. When we talk about inclusion of children with disabilities in education, we often talk about equal rights. But I want to talk about the right to equality, just very quickly. There are 2 reasons to think about equality. One is that we all have an ability to do the best that we can and to be equal in our rights to be educated. The other thing, though, is to have an education that makes us equal to the challenges that will come to us in our lives. Many of us will have many challenges with disability, first our child and then ourselves, or our elderly parents, or a neighbor, or someone else. In society, there is always disability. And I believe it's really important for us to have inclusive education for the purpose of educating all children. My son certainly, through inclusive education, became equal to the challenges that his life brought to him. And his brothers became equal to their tasks because they went to school with other children with disabilities. They didn't see disability as something that was only their brother, but that it was lots of young people in the world, and it was something to think about for all of us. So I hope we will think about that as we go forward today, is the huge benefits to society in general when people with disabilities are present, when they're visible, when they're treated with dignity and respect, when they are included from the heart in the work that we do. It's the right place for people with disabilities to be, and we have the ability to make that happen. And I hope in these next 3 days, we will find ways to collaborate with each other and around the world to make sure that we're advancing what's happening. I expect to learn a lot from the next 3 days that I can bring to my work on inclusive education in the United States and around the world. So thank you in advance for your participation and your careful listening as we go forward. It is now my enormous pleasure to introduce Manos Antoninas, who is the manager, the director of UNESCO's GEM Report team, to discuss the UNESCO GEM Report for 2020. Manos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Denise. For me, it is really humbling to have the opportunity to talk to you. I have only visited Russia before 1989. The only strong connection I have is that both my sons are actually learning Russian for the past 3 years. So, and I find that extremely exciting. And I'm really delighted seeing on the chat all these people joining, not only from Russia, but from the broader region. And this is precisely a thing that very kindly the co-organizers invited me to refer to our work, and also the special edition of our work on Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia, that nicely enough and suitably enough, we're going to be launching on Friday, on the 12th of February. And I hope that your discussions will nicely feed into that and find the reflections in one document. So let me share my screen, and while I do that, just to say a few things roughly about what we are, who we are. The Global Education Monitoring Report exists since 2002, and it is the tool of the international community to monitor progress on education in the international agenda, that is the Sustainable Development Goals to 2030. And we are an editorially independent team hosted by UNESCO, but we have an advisory board that guides us to select the theme that every year the report should be covering. And it was clear why our advisory board decided on the topic of inclusion a few years ago, on the report that was launched last June. In 2015, all the countries in the world agreed on Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is the goal on education, that envisages and calls on all countries to achieve inclusive and equitable education of good quality by 2030 for all. But it is fair to say that not all countries necessarily had a clear perception when they were putting their signature on the agreement what inclusive education meant. And we know very well that thanks to the efforts, the tireless efforts of people who have been supporting people, our fellow citizens with disabilities for many years, thanks to them, we came with the right to inclusive education enshrined in international law in 2006 with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But it took several years, and indeed, only until 2016, for the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to issue its General Comment number 4 on the interpretation of the right to inclusive education. And what essentially the key message from that General Comment is that at the end of the day, inclusion is not just about one group. because the mechanisms, the mentalities, the idea that some people have limited opportunity to learn, their ability to learn is fixed, actually affect many more. And also, disability in and by itself is not the only characteristic that determines the conditions that many people are facing, because many people have multiple identities, or intersecting identities, overlapping identities. So General Common 4, and that is the key message of this report, has been here to actually tell us that every country has mechanisms that exclude, and therefore we need to be very aware of that. And every country has to follow a process that will really try to resolve all those mechanisms that exclude students in any country. No country is perfect in that respect, and every country can follow its own process. But this introduction is necessary because essentially what we really need to mention is that we have seen inclusion from a very broad perspective. As you see, the reasons and the mechanisms that exclude can lead to many different types of exclusion all over the world. In 20 countries, there's not a single poor rural girl, for instance, that completes secondary school. Those who are being taught in their not taught in their mother tongue, in their home language, are 1/3 less likely to have basic reading skills. The same is true between the richest and the poorest. The richest have 2 times more likelihood to achieve the minimum skills in their life than the poorest. Refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. But yes, it is children with disabilities that at the end of the day end up being the most excluded among the excluded. In the worst form of exclusion that we have, those children who will never even ever go to school, and there are about 12 million of those, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to fall in this category. And we know that essentially the last year has been particularly difficult for issues of inclusion, especially for learners with disabilities. Because in many ways, governments are trying under very difficult circumstances to react and find solutions for the majority. Some of these distance learning solutions are really looking into the future. However, it is also easy to forget the principle, which usually we talk about in health, do no harm, but it also applies in education. Distance learning opportunities are imperfect, first of all, but also risk leaving behind further the most disadvantaged. We need, therefore, during this crisis, and it's the evidence shows, 1 in 4 countries in the region that I described between Central Europe and Central Asia did not actually take measures to support learners with disabilities. So we need to consider not only the academic, but also their social, emotional, and mental health needs. And we also need to consider the more complex processes of learning, and also what students have lost in terms of support, different types of support that they have been receiving, of course, particularly in the case of learners with disabilities, but also aspects of assessment, flexible schedules, flexible accommodations and arrangements that can suit every learner. The report has 10 recommendations. I'm going to go very briefly through them, just to give you a flavor of the range of aspects that we cover. The first is that it is very important to widen the understanding of inclusion. It is very important for countries to consider the exclusion of all groups. Currently, worldwide, only 1 in 3 have such definitions, but even that is only the first step towards a definition of inclusion that really does not categorize people, because inclusion is about quality education, and quality education is about everyone. The second recommendation refers to financing. This is a very complex issue. Many countries are struggling to come up with the right solution. Labeling is, of course, sometimes necessary to help administrations proceed, and there is also often talk of a twin-track approach of 2 ways, having good general funding and also targeted funding. But it is very important not to introduce incentives in the allocation of resources that inflate costs and do not really end up helping those learners that need most support. The third and very relevant recommendation for the region is the need to share expertise and resources. Inclusion is a management issue because traditionally, historically, it has been provided in a separate way, the support to learners with disabilities, and therefore often if you try to ensure that every child can learn in their local school, these resources may not be available. So it's very important for governments to ensure the equal allocation of these resources. The fourth is a recommendation that has to do also with advocacy. In order to achieve good quality inclusive education, it is necessary to talk both to those who might be opposing it and those who may be scared that their child may not get the support that they need. So governments need to engage very closely with parents, but also with community organizations that have been instrumental in providing such support. The fifth is the need to ensure cooperation across government. I know that the Russian Federation has been making good progress in that respect, especially in identification of needs and linking different organizations, but that needs to happen in all areas. Non-government actors have been particularly instrumental, and that's exactly the type of community we're in here today, organizations that have really gone beyond everything that was possible to guarantee the right, to ensure the right of inclusive education for all children. They have been acting as watchdogs, holding governments to account and ensure that they fulfill their commitments, but also providing services. And these services need to be aligned with the inclusion concept that governments endorse to make sure that they all work together. Universal design is a term that has been receiving a lot of support. It refers not only to infrastructure, accessibility of buildings and of environments, therefore not just to form, but also accessibility of content. And there have been a lot of interesting interventions that we need to follow, and I'm sure you're going to be talking about making curriculum, textbooks, and assessments accessible to everyone. Teachers need to be prepared to teach all students. We should not consider inclusive education, as often in the region it has been the case, as a specialist skill. Every teacher should be prepared to teach every student. That also includes school leaders who need to instill an inclusive ethos in their institutions, but also all the support personnel that need to be working to support teachers to complete their work. The ninth recommendation is about data collection. There has been a history of focusing attention on particular groups that risks labeling and stigmatization. It is a very sensitive issue. There needs to be very much attention and respect in how we collect data, but also what data we collect. Sometimes important issues like whether students feel cared for, the sense of belonging that they have is lost. And it's necessary to consider that in all our quality assessment frameworks in inclusive education. The final recommendation, and that's exactly what we're doing here today, is to learn from peers, to learn from each other. Because inclusion is a process. There's no concrete result that we can achieve. It's a result that is far in the horizon. We can reach it through different ways, and it's only if we talk. And that's I'm grateful, and I'm actually jealous that Sue can attend for 3 days this meeting, because I would also be willing to listen and learn from all of your diverse experiences from such different parts of your country. From our perspective, what we try to do, and you may want to consult as a resource, is to put all the information that we have collected on all countries in the world, 160 countries, all except for Europe, that has its own resources, that complements the report and provides information on laws and policies on how countries have approached inclusion in education. Maybe a resource that you can use, and also a resource that could be used also for monitoring the implementation of Article 24, at least as a baseline. I finish with my last slide. The report is available in a number of languages, and its summary as well in Russian. We have had the youth and the gender edition, but we have also an innovation as of last year of regional editions. And for the first time, the report is actually dedicating its attention to your part of the world. And it is a happy coincidence that in collaboration and in partnership with 2 expert organizations, the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education and the Network of Education Policy Centers, and I was very happy to see on the chat some of you. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you even better. We're launching this report on Friday, and we really hope that you can use it. Remember that you can use also a number of resources that we have on our site, this animation, a special video that will be making the case for inclusion that you can use in your networks. Our infographics and cartoons are all at your disposal, and we're more than happy to work with you to support your efforts. So thank you very much for this kind invitation. I wish you success in these 3 days and many lessons to be learned. And we're always interested in your feedback and how we can make our work always more relevant to you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Manos. And every time I hear you, there's something
Thank
new.
you very much.
Every time I hear you, there's something new, and you clearly are directing action at UNESCO on the GEM report. So I'm always impressed, and thank you so much for being with us today. I think it's really important for all of our Russian colleagues to have an opportunity to hear from world leadership on what's happening. And in that vein of world leadership, it is now my pleasure to introduce Diane Richler, who runs the Catalyst for Inclusive Education and has also made enormous contributions to the Inclusion International draft position on inclusive education, and also the International Disability Alliance and GLAAD and many other places where Diane's effort have been very meaningful. Diane, thank you for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue. Hello, everybody. Next slide, please. First of all, I'm really sorry that because of the pandemic, we can't be in Russia today. Like Sue, I've been there a few times, had a chance to meet many people at Perspectiva and many of the partners, and I would much rather be there right now than sitting at home. So good to see you. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do actually is to build on a number of things that Manos said, because what I've been asked to talk about is some of the international context and some of the tools and advocacy mechanisms that exist globally. Manos already made reference both to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll refer to those a little bit more in the context of Russia and your region, and also want to talk about UNDIS, which is the United Nations Disability Strategy. Next slide, please. Manos mentioned the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I don't know if all of you are aware of it and aware of the fact that Russia ratified the convention in 2012. The process for monitoring the convention is that for every country that has ratified, there's an obligation to present reports to the committee that's responsible for overseeing the convention every couple of years. The committee that's made up of elected members from all of the countries that have ratified the convention studies the state report and also hears from civil society organizations and makes a number of recommendations, or what they call concluding observations, on the initial report. And what's really striking to me, since I was in Russia before Russia ratified the convention, in fact, before the convention came into effect, and the report from the Russian Federation to this committee responsible for the convention happened several years ago, there was huge progress already in 2018 from the time that I had been there, and now catching up on what's happened even in the last 2 years, I see continual progress. So in the report from the committee on what was happening in Russia, they mentioned a number of positive aspects, particularly the increase in the number of students with disabilities who were now included in inclusive education. That was really a change. but they did raise a number of concerns, mostly related to a lack of transparent financial resources and regional disparities due to different conditions and different financial conditions in different regions. And I think that that's clearly one of the things that's going to come up over the next couple of days. And one of the strong recommendations from the committee was for the government to promote and embrace the concept of quality inclusive education in line with general comment 4 that Manos referred to. Next slide, please. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, Manos mentioned Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. I won't go into detail on that, except to say that it's a huge step forward to show how the concept of inclusive education, which started really from parents like Sue and families around the world seeing that not only their sons and daughters who had disabilities would benefit, but that all children would benefit from inclusive education, has now become a topic not only for those working on disability issues, but much more broadly. Next slide, please. The United Nations has gone so far as to develop what they're calling a disability inclusion strategy, which is the foundation for including persons with disabilities through all the work of the United Nations. And that means a reaffirmation of the recognition of human rights of all persons with disabilities as just part of human rights altogether. And that affects all UN agencies, UNICEF, UNESCO, UNDP, etc. Next slide, please. So the convention is important, and I've mentioned that. I want to mention, though, that there are other global processes that are more informal. And for example, Russia hosted the meeting of G8 countries in 2006. Sue and I had the privilege of being part of a civil society forum that took place in Moscow before that meeting. And because of a focus on inclusion in the discussions of education, for the first time, there was reference to including learners with disabilities in the statement that came out of that G8 meeting. Now, that may seem very lofty and very far away, but the fact is that that kind of statement then influences the policies of all of the major countries in the world. And the work by Perspective and others to make sure that learners with disabilities were included in the agenda of the G8 meeting was really important. Finally, Sue mentioned that Inclusion International has put a major focus on inclusive education, including through a program called the Catalyst for Inclusive Education, through which we try to support our members to be more effective in their advocacy. And I think it's worth underlining the fact that many of our member organizations in over 115 countries around the world, many of them started specifically because the sons and daughters of the founding members were not allowed to go to school. And so many of those organizations started the first schools for kids with intellectual disabilities, and then through that process recognized that being educated apart led to a life apart. And as they started to experiment and get support from educators to develop more inclusive systems, we learned that inclusive education, as Manos said, and as the GEM report says, inclusive education is not just good for learners with disabilities, it's good for all children. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do now is to clarify what our own position is on inclusive education and try to be more precise about what some of the bottom lines are in terms of understanding the need for including learners with intellectual disabilities in particular and how to do that. And so we now have a draft position paper that's out for consultation with all of our members. As Manos said, we know that learners with disabilities are at the highest risk of being excluded. What we understand is that it's not just any disability, but in fact, those with intellectual disabilities are the most likely to be excluded. And the best way to respect the rights of learners with intellectual disabilities and provide quality education is to have systems that are inclusive of everyone. For us, the right to inclusive education means that all students, including those with intellectual disabilities, are taught in schools where they learn together with students with and without disabilities, everyone in school and in classes together. They receive a good quality education, not just a focus on life skills, but really having access to the full curriculum. They're accepted and enjoy a feeling of belonging at school. That's something that Manos underlined too, a recognition that we don't just want children with disabilities to attend school, we want them to feel welcome and that they're not subjected to discrimination, exclusion, or segregation. And that includes things like being registered at school, but being told not to attend and maybe having a teacher visit every so often to provide some education. It means being fully included and going to school on the same schedule as everyone else. A truly inclusive education system enables access to education, to related services and support for all students to participate fully and effectively, and enables all students to progress and establishes high expectations for all learners. So for this to happen, it really requires a transformation of education systems, not just some incremental changes, but some fundamental ones. And hopefully that's what we're going to hear more about over today and the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane, for your timeliness and excellent report. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of this section. So if you have questions for Manos or Diane or for Ruchi, our next speaker, we will have some time for that immediately after Ruchi's presentation. I now have the pleasure of introducing Ruchi Singh, who is a world expert on inclusive education and is a member of the World Bank team. So Ruchi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sue. And Nancy, if I can have this slide. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks, Sue, and thanks to Manos and Diane. And it's a pleasure to be here with the group from Russia to really talk about some of the specifics on inclusive education. What I'm going to focus today is on a specific paper that was written in collaboration by the World Bank with Inclusion International and Leonard Cheshire, and it's a pivotal paper in terms of putting the issue of learning outcomes and the measurement of learning outcomes for learners with disabilities on the forefront. So what I'm going to share is that what I would recommend is that because the paper is quite long, I am happy to send a link into the chat box. And along with that, I would also put a plug for the participants to really look at the GEM report's background paper on which is titled Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Inclusion of Learning Assessments and Measurement Challenges. And I really recommend that paper again. Next slide, please. The paper, Every Learner Matters, establishes the learning crisis for children with disabilities and presents an evidence of how and why children with disabilities are being left behind. The paper, when it was written, was aligned with the message of the World Bank's 2018 World Development Report, which is titled Learning to Realize Education Promise. And the World Development Report's basis, the basis is it argues that the focus needs to shift from school access to priority learning. And this paper also examines education systems and the importance of measuring learning achievements for children with disabilities to respond appropriately to needs of all students. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you go on the previous slide? I'm so sorry. All right. So like I said, the WTR, the World Bank's report, identified the outcomes as a crisis and made a detailed case back in 2018 for using data to understand learning achievement amongst learners. Using evidence, the data evidence from learning assessments as a mechanism to improve classroom learning and aligning the stakeholders to bring a systemic change in the education system. But it's interesting, and it doesn't come as a surprise after Manos's presentation, is that children with disabilities, and for children with disabilities, the learning crisis is multifold. It is about education access. It's also about education equity, education quality, and then learning as well. So school access continues to be a challenge for most children with disabilities. So an analysis which was conducted by UNESCO also identified that there were large disability gaps in primary and secondary school attendance, and that the disability gaps in terms of education access varies by the type of disability itself. It concluded that children with disabilities have fewer years of education and are less likely to possess basic literacy skills. So in a sense, some data points around that really throw a spotlight to the issue. In 2020, the Education Monitoring Report put out an analysis that out of 10 low and low middle income countries, children with disabilities were 19% less likely to achieve the minimum proficiency in reading than those without disabilities. We also know from the work which has happened at the World Bank that the gap in literacy rates between persons with disabilities and without disabilities has widened over time. Evidence of various studies also suggested that children with disabilities do worse on assessment than their peers, and this can be due to a range of issues, including access barriers as well as barriers to really get accommodations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the assessments are, why is assessments so important, and what is the rationale for focusing on learning assessments? Assessments are a main vehicle for understanding the effectiveness of the education systems and the only source of operationalizing monitoring targets in under the SDG 4. Standardized assessments of learning outcomes are an important source of information for stakeholders at national, regional, as well as global level, which helps them to engage in educational development discourse and policies. Exclusion from assessments risks producing a very distorted picture of learning outcomes at a national and international level and obscures learning inequalities in learning outcomes. And exclusion can occur on several grounds, including disability, location, language of instruction, risk of underperformance, health, cultural reasons, or safety as well. But assessments have different purpose at different levels of education system. At the classroom level, assessment helps teachers to modify instructions. At a school level, Assessments can help school principals and school management committees to improve school resources and the learning experience for all children, including children with disabilities. And at the government level, the measurement can help in understanding the overall performance of the education system and to develop appropriate policies to improve learning. For all children with disabilities, irrespective of the category of disability that they belong to or that they are put into, the implication of improvement of improved learning outcomes and the acquisition of meaningful knowledge and skills in inclusive learning environments has immense benefits, including long-term economic benefits. Enrolling and retaining children with disabilities in school has a potential to lift individuals and their families out of poverty and marginalized existences. Next slide, please. Research indicates that for improving the quality of education, the countries must know where their education system stands. The impact of disability on school access, participation, and performance needs much more attention, and data on the number of children with disabilities and their performance, or that their lack of availability of data, has an effect. The paper further goes on to examine what does data provide information on. Data is powerful to understand who is not learning, what are they not learning, what are the learning gaps, as well as what resources are most needed and can be channeled in resource scarce environments. And in resource scarce environments, and under size of the target population and their performance can affect every aspect of service delivery. The paper further argues that due to lack of data, education planners cannot make informed decisions to allocate resources to improve school learning environments for children with disabilities. The lack of any data around learning levels and needs of children with disabilities leads to poor support mechanisms and poor reasonable accommodations. Education planners do not know what and where and what kind of targeted support is needed. This means that learning materials, teacher training programs, curriculum, infrastructure, as well as assistive technology are not made available to the diverse needs of children. Next slide, please. GEM report indicates in its background paper that around 38 million children are without any data representing the reading literacy learning outcomes. 34 million out of them are living under low and middle income countries. Exclusion from the learning assessments at a regional, national, and an international level are covered in detail in the paper, Every Learner Matters, and I encourage participants to read it. But overall, a few patterns of exclusion emerge. Why are children with disabilities excluded out of these learning assessments? One is that children might be excluded because they fail to meet the criteria of the target population, or they may be outside the target population because they study in special schools or hostels or are over age. Children with disabilities might also be a part of the target population, even when children with disabilities might be a part of the target population, they may be excluded due to intellectual disabilities or other functional disabilities. And finally, exclusion may also happen due to the modality of data collection or the accommodations provided. Hence, children with disabilities can be excluded out of the target population, which gets to participate in learning assessments due to a whole range of issues which have been outlined here. Next slide, please. Hence, it is important to highlight a few things. We have to rethink about assessments. what should be assessed is one key question. We need to look at some comprehensive assessments which should focus on curriculum and how each learner can learn within that curriculum. Various authors have also suggested that assessment of children with disabilities needs to go beyond the traditional boundaries and the traditional boundaries of assessment. We also need to rethink what methods of assessments can be used. Can multiple forms of assessment cater to all children? Can methods such as observations and collecting work samples also prove useful for education planning purposes? Then there's this whole question about reasonable accommodations which can be provided in assessments. And then finally, there is the whole question of assessments for learning, informing, teaching with a purpose where formative assessments guide teachers to teach children with disabilities. Hence, I conclude by saying this, that all children need to be included in educational assessments if assessments are to be truly equitable and useful for monitoring of global goals, as well as monitoring social progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. I very much appreciate your timeliness. We now have a few minutes for questions, and I have 3 questions in front of me, and I'm not sure which speaker would like to answer which question. So the first question is, could you characterize any indicators of successful psychological and cultural belonging of learners with disabilities to inclusive groups in education and in society in general? I looked it up quickly. There are several scales being used. I want to just say from the get-go that the key, I believe, is that the person is able to participate as their authentic self. Manos, I see you've turned on your camera, so perhaps you would like to answer.
I thought you might expect me to have an answer. It's not an
Yes, thank
easy question. And I wouldn't necessarily use scales because no education system can actually use scales per se. But the report makes the recommendation, and I think it's a very, very important question, to say that education management information systems need to track, as I said earlier, also how children feel at school. We have some information from learning assessments. Learning assessments like PISA, for instance, do ask students, so the 15-year-olds who are in school, which is, of course does not include all potential learners because some have not reached that stage and still be in school, but those who still are, and if they have not been excluded from the process, which is also another problem, the other students are being asked, how do you feel? Do you feel like a stranger in school? So this is a fairly easy question that any education system can potentially follow. But even at the school level, it is possible to expect schools to follow that question, whether children feel cared for, whether they form positive relationships, whether they belong, as you were saying earlier. And we have very few examples around the world that do that. New Zealand is an example of a country that has institutionalized such questions in its system. And why not look at that, to that part of the world, to get some lessons about how to approach this question.
Thank you, Manos. I'm grateful for the answer. I am going to move us on without addressing the next 2 questions because I don't want to provide less time to the Russian segment of the program here. I really want to make sure that Russian speakers have plenty of time for everything. The next 2 questions were recorded in chat and they will be part of the record of this meeting. They're important questions, so I urge you to look at the chat and think about what your answer would be to those questions. Now, as we move to the Russian segment of the program, it is my pleasure first to introduce Yanina Arsenyeva, who is an invited expert on the presentation of the analytical document prepared for the preparation of the seminar. I think everyone here has seen that document. Yanina, the floor is yours.
Большое спасибо. Спасибо,
Thank
Sue.
you very much. Thank you, esteemed colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this project, despite my name, Arsenieva. I am not from Russia, I'm from Estonia. And I approached this particular topic from, so to say, a detached point of view. I did not know a lot about the inclusive education in Russia. My project was to provide a wide scope review, a very general review on what is happening in Russia with inclusive education right now. I suppose there will be a number of obscure maybe points in the report, and maybe I could correct and update them, but we were I channeled my attention to the tendencies in inclusive education in Russia. I decided not to provide a presentation, but I would like to provide a number of conclusions that I made, a number of tendencies that were presented by the representatives of the project. So this is my evaluation of what I have read up to date on the topic and what I have studied up to date on the topic. So shall I present a number of tendencies, and some of them upon which we can build on the following processes. As was already pointed out, Russian Federation has done a number of very significant steps forward towards the development of inclusive education. If we compare the results nowadays with the 1990s or the previous years, and in 2006, when the G8 summit took place and Russia hosted the G8 meeting. And even 2.5 years, Russia was reviewed on the inclusion of disabled persons into educational processes. Yes, we can point out the progress, not only in the legislative sphere, but in the practical application as well. The other point is that when I conducted the research, I was astounded by the fact that there wasn't really enough information, but in this particular case, the materials were in abundance, and that was quite a contrast to what I was expected. I was provided with a number of reviews, scientific research, and all the necessary data. Every topic was elaborated upon. There were webinars, conferences, and different types of exchange of opinions. So there's quite a dynamic development in this sphere. So this is what is the driver for the development of inclusive education in Russia. And the third point, which I find important to point out, is something which is obvious for me, and maybe obvious for you, because and because we all work in different countries. The Russian practices are examples to follow for many other countries of our region, and can serve as positive examples to be advocated, to be supported, because this rich experience may serve as a foundation for the support of other countries that are targeting inclusive education, which is important for both for regional and international experiences. And the other 3 points that I wanted to mention in order to improve, 3 points to improve on perhaps, and the 3 points that we can use for future cooperation in the field. Those people I have spoken, they Russian legislation,
Это мне говорили все, это я сама прочитала в законе. Но потом люди точно так же мне говорили, что терминология, которая присутствует в законодательстве, она очень крайне затрудняет осуществление
terminology and the definitions
образования
used
на
in
практике.
the laws
Есть законодательный конфуз между
preclude
особыми
further
образовательными
development of
потребностями,
inclusive education that
которые
may be
являются
equivalent
частью
for the
определения
implementation of the
инклюзивного
processes
и
themselves
правом детей с
and
ограниченными
the
возможностями
rights
здоровья.
of children
То
with
есть законодательство
disabilities
и
and
практики,
health
они все
issues,
концентрируются
limitations
на именно
in this field
ограниченных
of health.
возможностях
So
здоровья.
the Russian
И
legislation
что это значит на
dwells on the
практике? Это
topic
что
of
все программы
health
поддержки,
limitations,
ресурсы,
children with
услуги,
health
они
limitations.
концентрируются
So
именно на
all
возможностях
services
здоровья.
in
И мы
this
из практики,
sphere are
говорим
based
практики инклюзивного
on
образования,
problems
я думаю, всем
connected
это известно, что
with
очень
the health
часто
issues of the children.
исключение из образования,
And that
из
allows for
качественного, достойного
exclusion
образования,
of children
оно
with other
является
disabilities from
оно
general
результатом
education.
именно какого-то излишней
So,
концентрации на возможностях
uh,
здоровья.
the
Очень часто
paying
поддержка,
special
которую
attention
необходимо
to these health
предоставить
issues
ребенку, предоставить учащемуся,
include other
она
categories of
ничего
children
общего
with
со здоровьем.
disabilities
Но так как законодательство концентрируется на ограниченных
accepted into
возможностях
the
здоровья,
general
то это очень
type of
затрудняет
education. So this
продвижение
particular
концепции
terminology, this
инклюзивного
particular
образования
aspect
на практике.
is a certain obstacle.
Второй
Second-
момент, на который я хотела бы обратить
Second
внимание,
point I wanted to
это
dwell on.
несмотря на то,
Janina,
что есть очень
Janina,
законодательные
hello?
прорывы,
Despite the
законодательство, оно,
fact
я думаю, это можно сказать и про
that
законодательство, наверное, и других стран, его всегда можно улучшать. Его очень часто
despite the
можно
fact that
улучшать
the
до бесконечности.
legislation is in place, I mean,
В российском
legislation
же
can be
контексте
improved
существует
on
гораздо
in many other
дополнительный
countries.
нюанс.
Janina, we're having trouble with the translation right now.
Sorry.
So I wondered,
Sorry.
I just want to ask the translator, the English translator, to check her mic.
Yes, is everything all right? My mic is on. Can you hear me?
We lost you there for a while, so please pay special attention to it. Thank you.
Hello, can you
Now
excuse
it's
me?
better, much better.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Janina. Please go ahead. Sorry.
So, the first point, once again, the legislative base and some legislative points that I pay special attention to, special needs versus the health limitations. And the second point is the ability to improve the legislation, to improve on the processes and the practices for the development of individual programs for children with disabilities and individual approaches. We understand that it is quite understandable that there will be difficulties in changing the legislation. There will be certain challenges in order to change legislation in many countries and in the Russian Federation. And you will know that there are so many interests, so many regions, so many contexts to work on. So the changes in federal legislation may take time and a lot of effort, but we are waiting for improvements. But while we are waiting for the improvements from top to bottom, it is important to start changing and improving on some of the rules and practices bottom up, from bottom to top, starting at the lower levels, at our level. We talked to our colleagues about the improvement of interdepartmental coordination of activities without any specific targeted financial investments in order to provide for inclusive education, where there are positive dynamics, where there is a wish and desire of the participants of the process to improve the situation on a national and regional level, even if there isn't enough money currently from the federal level, even if there are obstacles on the way. And it's quite possible. And the development of services for the support of families, we have already introduced a number of such mechanisms into society, which allow for the support of families with children who suffer from certain disabilities, is quite possible and obtainable. And this is something I noted in my research. And the development of this psychological, medical, pedagogical help or assistance. The other things that seemed important to me is the ambiguous assessment of the human resources issue. I heard I heard of three important tendencies. The first is that there aren't enough specialists on mental defects and physical handicaps. And
Thank you.
Sue, did you want to say anything? You raised
I'm
your
sorry, I'm
hand.
trying to manage time. So I interrupted you, so I gave you a little extra time, but
Хорошо.
I realize
Я
your
почти
expertise is
закончила, я
very
почти
extensive,
закончила.
and thank you so much.
Первое, то, что я услышала.
So the first thing that I learned is that there aren't enough experts in the field, like specialists in mental defects and physical handicaps and speech therapists, that the teachers who are in place nowadays, unfortunately, do not always answer to the expectations of today, of the current moment. And the third point is that there isn't enough support rendered to the general staff, the staff of the schools, paying special attention to these aspects is highly important. This is something I would have liked to discuss with you. The profession of speech therapists, specialists on mental defects and physical handicaps, the development of these spheres is one of the most topical issues in this area.
Thank you.
I know that as an expert and a specialist in the field.
Thank you.
And the last point I wanted to make is highly important. During the research, I made contact with wonderful experts and specialists, and I had the opportunity to get into contact with the parents committees, but I haven't encountered a single invalid or disabled person. I haven't made any particular contact with the representatives of this community. So I think we need to provide for the advocacy of the disabled person's position.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I believe the International Disability Alliance works very hard on that piece of how do we bring in the point of view of persons with disabilities, many of whom, in fact, were disabled after they finished their schooling. And so they may not exactly have they may not exactly have the experience that we need for school. But I would also like to ask you, please, if you could leave contacts. So we will send you the presentations in Russian, and so that we can keep in touch with you. If you leave your email address or your contact information in the chat box, then we can collect that. And I am going to move quickly now to our next presentation because we really are learning a lot from these. And the next one is about inclusion today in Russia. And the presenter is Svetlana Alyokina. Sorry, I'm terrible on pronunciations. Director of the Institute of Inclusive Education. Yanina, you have 10 minutes. Thank you so much for being with us today. Sorry, Svetlana.
Спасибо большое, спасибо, Сью, за 10 минут. Это очень важное время. Я приветствую всех участников.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. 10 minutes is quite a lot, and I'm very grateful for this format of the events that we're having today. I believe it's very important. It's very important to get introduced into the not only local context, but the global context, which is very important. Tackle the problems of inclusive education in particular countries. And since we have this event for 3 days, we'll have very extensive information, and I believe we'll be able to cover many issues. I would like to focus on some very important things to my mind to explain what is happening with inclusive education here and now in 2021 in Russia after 8 years of the law that was passed and the term of inclusive education that was approved. The idea, the concept has been developing and in progress in the real educational practice. We are all aware of what is happening. We understand that that's the beginning. That's the time of coming to the awareness about this concept and registering it at the level of the government policy. I think that we have done this quite successfully because the concept is reflected not only in law but also in all educational standards and also professional standards and also standards for the training of future professionals. A new professional sector introduced, for instance, a tutor for inclusive education, and I'll get back to this point once again. Methodology of all standards has been adjusted accordingly. The whole policy is in place now, and it has been transformed starting with educational law and local regulations and orders and directives and normative acts, both at the level of the federal level and at the local levels. We are a large country of 85 regions, and starting with 24 the central The central mandate authority is concentrated, and that is and everything that is relevant for financial things and staffing, etc., goes to the regional level. Setting up standards and norms under the mandate of the federal authority. There is a gap. The gap in the inequality of or disparity, better say, disparity of regions in economic terms, in financial terms, and every region has its own regulation and financial instruments or tools of support of children with disabilities, including mental disabilities in their schools. And the spread is considerable. Much depends on the economic situation of the particular region and its ability to give additional financial support to ensure educational opportunities for children with disabilities. And that's something that calls for systemic approach, disparity, economic disparity among regions, and also we need not only ensure access to education, but also the quality of education. Methodological gap is also in the place, and that's what we have now. Terminology discussion is going on. It's not about it's not the terminology, but terms, but actually the essence of what regulates our professional thinking and also the economy of inclusive education. The term that we have in since 2008, a student with limited health abilities. The focus is done on medical diagnosis. The category is developed, which is supported by the medical system of disability, and this status is given usually by teachers and psychologists, a team of them. But how's that related to the status of disability? That's a statistical question as well, a statistical issue. The children with disability, with health disability, also include children with mental disability. For instance, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the proportion is about 50-50. Every child with a disability, every child with a disability, and two children with problems in health, and the balance may be different in different regions. And again, we get to the point of regional disparity in the situation. Special educational needs, that's another concept that's being discussed, and we have raised this issue at the State Duma, and education everywhere is being developed with a focus on this, but this category is much broader than children who fall ill often or have a medical diagnosis. Now that will call for some additional financial resources to support children with special educational needs. And Russia, with its current economic situation, is not quite ready for this yet. And the third area of work in the development of inclusive education is the idea of continuity and coherence. Everything that is connected with continuity of an individual educational trajectory and coherence in that. For a number of years, we have been developing the design of all educational verticals, starting with primary school and with higher school, or actually starting with preschool to high school. We see that the level of inclusion of children with disability goes down. For instance, if we take the primary school and secondary education, the level of inclusion, according to the statistics of last year, is 8% of the total population of children going to primary school. But if we take a higher school or the higher education school, or within the 5 years of accessible environment process, so we have been developing inclusive environment in universities of Russia. The level of inclusion there is even less than 1%. Although the government quota envisages 10%, but this is just a startup. This is a starting point for many of us, and we are still to become aware of how it is transformative it is for a society, for the rules and regulations, and for the higher school. That's the very, very beginning of their long path in this direction. And methodological vector is very important for us. We study, we undertake research from the point of continuity. So starting with 2010, our standards have included the notion of individual learning plan and individual educational trajectory. That's not only for children with disabilities or special needs, but also for gifted and talented students. So starting with a couple of years ago, we have begun to develop the institution of tutors. Very few yet, but some teacher training colleges have a special program for training tutors for students with special needs. And that's a challenge for us. It's not only it's not only a matter of professional training, but also of motivation for future teachers to become tutors for students with special needs. We should keep special benefits, social benefits in mind for such people. But nevertheless, we have made this very important step, which will give a special place for children with mental disabilities in school, and the institution of tutors is developing, is underway. And the last point that I wanted to mention is assessment of the inclusive process. That's the task that we have on the current agenda, because there are many innovative there are many innovative challenges. Many children study at home, although according to the statistics, they are included in the general general education. They are counted as those who are part of the general education, but they're actually sitting at home and our own tutoring there. So that's a methodological approach that we need to also to tackle. We need to take kids out of their home environment and bring them into classrooms. But the process is on the way, and the quality of education, of inclusive education, is of a very high priority for us. We learn from others' experience, other experiences, and we also form our own assessment projects and scales of assessment. This year we'll have a 6th international conference on effectiveness of inclusive education, and I invite all of you to take part in it. Yes, I see that you're signaling that I'm going to finish, so I'm over.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your insight and your input, and for your invitation to others to participate with you. It is now my pleasure to introduce, my extreme pleasure, to introduce Elena Klochko, who is chairperson of the All Russian Organization of Parents of Children with Disabilities. Elena, are you with us? Floor is yours.
Большое спасибо. Добрый день, коллеги. Я не...
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Well, I will not fit into 10 minutes that I'm given, but I sent a link to the chat on the assessment on the poll that we had for parents with children with disabilities, and maybe I'm too pessimistic today, but well, accept me the way I am. It's very difficult. I should say is that inclusive education is developing with much challenge in Russia. We all thought that as soon as the law on education stated inclusive education that was not supported by regulatory acts, at that point we were aware that it will take some time, but we're in 2021 already, 7 years or nearly more than 7 years have passed since the law on education was passed. Well, it was actually in 2012, I think. It was adopted in 2012. And a large number of children were not given a high quality education. And in the poll, the link to which I gave, we see that home education is very widely spread. Children of different categories, children, so-called inclusive children that were to be taken under program number 1 and 2 with the excuse is that there is no proper staff at school, no premises, and that means under financing at the regional level. The second category is those who should study according to corrective curriculum. They also put the left at home for education because of understaffing and underfinancing. So the number of them is high. About 40% of children who are under who are registered as inclusive education students, but they're actually learning at home, and the Ministry of Education agrees with this. The sad story is that every success story in every region requires enormous effort, either filing a lawsuit or appeals to the Ministry of Education or Department of Education. Although the federal level, the whole situation was well worked in, but the order 1015 is not enforced. It now has a different number, but the essence is that such students require whole set of experts and teachers, including therapists, etc. Once a year, we have a joint meeting with the regions, with the Ministry of Education and departments of education, and representatives of regional branches of our organization. And the Ministry of Education agreed with our assessment, but we didn't have any other progress. Well, much can be explained by the pandemic lockdown. Well, that's one of the reasons. We understand that no progress has been done, and actually all kids were on home education. There are no curriculum had been developed, no specialists, no experts, no clear plan of training and retraining of specialists for the whole Russian Federation. No plan in place. There are some elements of the system in place, some regional institutions of education that do their best, and as for pedagogical or teacher training colleges and universities, if we are right in our assessment, the number of graduates in this is not enough, and everything is done under all obsolete standards of training. So the situation is very sad. It is sad because we lose whole generations of children, although we encourage parents in regions to be very active and stand their ground to demand quality education for their children. It happens in some places, but not at the speed, not at the level that we could speak about that as a success story. Colleagues from Verdi, from the order 1015 allows us to get in touch with to link actually to the educational standards, where under which curriculum kids can get additional number of academic hours, and thus they will get some additional training. And it's the paths is different for different regions. In spite of all our appeals, not that many regions decided to use this incremental per capita factor. This is only the Volgograd region that adopted the factors that I mentioned. In Kalmykia, they in Lipetsk, Moscow region, in Moscow itself, had an increased level of financing per capita only for children with disability, not for children with poor health. And the sum that is allocated for children with general health problems is not more than 20,000 per year, not that much. So the law on education is in place, is in action, but regions are to cover that, to ensure that with their own financing, with their own budgets. And that's a challenge for many of them. The answer is just one that we hear. The region has no money. That's the answer that we hear quite often. We got to the level of the Constitutional Court at some points. So the response was that it cannot be an excuse because budgets of all regions are interconnected.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt. We lost the English translation microphone again.
Microphone is on. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Может быть, мне продолжить по-русски, чтобы...
Can't hear the translator at all.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Just barely. No, just barely.
Just barely? And now?
No.
Okay. Sure. I'll just switch it off. What about now? Is it okay? Is it better?
It's not really okay. It's very, very faint.
Very, very faint. Now, I'll try now.
Better?
Okay, I'll keep shouting. Okay. Yes, I'm on.
Смотря кто, я вас
Elena,
слышу.
please go ahead and we'll see if the translator's microphone works.
Yes, it's working. It's working.
Shall I start?
Да.
Спасибо большое. Я отметила отсутствие государственного...
I have pointed out the fact that there is no specific state policy in the sphere of education, inclusive education. The inclusive policies, the policy of inclusive education is being dealt with basically on a regional level rather than the state level. We need a comprehensive state policy in this department. The decisions that are taken in particular have to be translated to other regions. One of the institutions, one of the spheres and powers that can allow for inclusive education to be introduced are the Ministry of Education. But there are a number of legal collisions between the professional standards and the levels of education. There are a number of problems connected with a number of years that the children have to work in the sphere. As to the federal state standard, there was no particular indicator as to the educational level of those who participate in the process. I don't quite understand what seems to be the problem in trying to resolve it on the level of the ministry issue. We discussed a number of days ago that the parents should be included in the work, but it is difficult for the parents. They have been waging this battle for quite a number of years already, having exhausted their potential in that field. So the most important thing that should drive the situation forward is to work out a roadmap that has been mentioned, a roadmap for the development of inclusive education that will include the issues connected to the education of migrants, the children of migrant families, the children with special needs. But in practice, the law of education has not yet been adopted in its full potential. Currently, the experts and the parents are taking part in the development of these areas. But unfortunately, that there isn't enough financing, and currently we have are circling back to the initial position in the development of inclusive education.
Thank you. Thank you so much. These are universal problems, aren't they? We face them everywhere as parents around the world. So it's good that we can connect to each other. My next speaker is Elena, let me get this right, Bagarodnikova, pretty close, I think, who is Executive Director of the parents organization Contact, which supports children on the autism spectrum. Elena, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Так, я могу включить, да?
Can I switch on my presentation?
Видно ли меня?
Is the presentation on? Is everything okay?
Скажите мне что-нибудь.
Colleagues, can you please tell me if you can see my presentation?
Спасибо большое.
Yes, we can see it.
Собственно говоря, выступить.
Thank you very much
сказать, что
for
поддерживаю всех, кто
writing
в озвучивании проблематики, проблем, и хочу сказать, что полностью разделяю
problem. I fully agree with my colleagues and materials I share their views, and in our practice, come face to face with practically the same problems.
I deeply apologize, Elena. English translator, your mic is fading again.
Oh, gosh. Is it okay now? Yeah,
Just
No.
barely.
just there. I don't know.
Видимо, я должна как-то это медленно делать.
Нет, дело не в этом.
Да. Да.
Please go ahead, Elena.
Okay. Okay.
Так, давайте поэкспериментируем. Слышно ли теперь?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Ну, я тогда хотела бы продолжить. Мы всегда впереди своей страны. То есть мало того, что, в общем, наши города
We envisage the same problems as the other regions of the country. And but nevertheless, a lot of those who live in different regions of the Russian Federation seek better help in Moscow. We see how the situation is changing. And as a mother of a child with special needs and as a tutor and an expert in the topic, I have been studying the dynamics on the basis of my own practical experience. The situation in Moscow and the situation in the Moscow region are approximately the same. A lot of parents with children who have the autism spectrum disorder try to move closer to Moscow to seek better professional help. Well, as far as the situation in Moscow is concerned, I will bring you statistics and I will bring you up to date. The system that exists in Moscow is not the topic, of course, of our discussion today, but the examples that we have already heard, the examples of certain deficiencies of the system and the challenges are also applicable to Moscow and the district. So the regions that will pass on to the following level of the inclusive education will also come face to face with certain problems. So I think that statistics is highly important, and we need to work out a method of including all the children in the statistics. Unfortunately, the statistics that we have nowadays does not reflect the situation accurately. Where does the data come from? The data comes from the Department of the Social Security Department data, which is also obtained from other official sources, and sometimes exclude parents with children who come from other regions and from the Moscow region. So this is an important point that this category of children with spectrum disorder is not accurately reflected in the general statistics. The problems that are connected with this state can be different, and depending on the status, the children are provided with the necessary educational programs. So, in accordance with the data of the Educational Ministry, 80,000 children in 2020 had the status of health limitations, disturbances, and health limitations. The Ministry of Education have not been including those who have not entered this inaccurate statistics. And this is not only the case in Moscow, but in many other regions. Moscow is trying not to actually provide necessary data which to other regions. It doesn't submit to other regions. Therefore, the data that is being provided is not transparent enough. We do not have the direct data, but we can count children with autism spectrum disorder in Moscow account for 35,000 in accordance with our calculations. Of course, the children from the Moscow region are not included into the list of those provided with the educational services. Of course, we also encounter the same problems in our department. That is the lack of tutors and specially trained teachers. We have also encountered quite a number of challenges due to the pandemic. I suppose I will not be able to give you my full presentation, and now I've lost this one. Like in every other region, we have certain obstacles. We do not have a strategy for the educational development for children with autism spectrum disorder. We do not have a single program. And starting from 2018, we have no indicators and nosological indicators. The situation was quite difficult, and when the law was adopted, the parents' movement was one of the main drivers for the development of inclusive education. And the Moscow Association of Children with Disabilities, which had been formed in 2015, and I am the member of the board, took very active part in trying to resolve the problematic issues connected with children with autism spectrum disorder and others. We have a number of serious and maybe less serious achievements, achievements which allowed children to participate more actively in the high school educational system. And the most important aspect is that the category of ineducable children have been excluded And in Moscow, and in the Moscow region, this problem was resolved for the first time. It was quite a serious achievement. And the parents themselves took it upon themselves to pay for some additional services for tutors, and they themselves became experts in the field. Now the situation is changing. We, thanks to the introduction of the educational system of tutors, have been able to get access to their professional help and aid. It is highly important for well-prepared tutors to take over the process. And sometimes a tutor who has not received adequate training can simply destroy the whole process. We had a number of resources classes introduced, and the parents took active part working out a series of methods for the education of their children in form of recommendations which were accepted by the resource classes.
Thank you.
So, the parents support a number of other inclusive methods. The majority of slides are dedicated to statistics. I will skip them, but there are quite a lot of children with autism spectrum disorder who attend classes in general school.
Обучение на дому, когда ребенок в частичной инклюзии, а на самом деле учится дома за счет родителей, она стала намного меньше, чем была. И это тоже заслуга родителей. Это заслуга общественных организаций.
The fact that many kids study not only at home, but they do that at the expense of their parents, but get to study to learn at schools in the inclusive education should be commanded to the to our ministry and also to parents. If previously we had just dozens of appeals from parents that saying that it's impossible to get access to inclusive education, but now kids get 3 or 4 hours a day, and that didn't fit any norms and regulations. But we managed to change the situation through raising awareness among parents. So I would like to show a number of slides from graphs from the resource center. So Moscow shows a very high level of inclusion for kids with autistic disorder spectrum. Tutors of highest demand now. Well, am I out of time completely?
Yes, you are. I'm so sorry, Elena. This is very interesting. And I know that's one of the problems we have is we have very high level speakers and there's so much information to share, but I want us to have time to exchange ideas with each other at the end. So thank you. I'm very grateful for your presentation. And it is now my pleasure to invite Andrei Sarev, who is involved with education for children with complex needs and is director of the State Budget Educational Institution Center of Medical Education and Differentiated Learning. Andrei, are you with us?
Да, я здесь.
Sir, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, dear colleagues. Thank you very much. I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to speak at the conference. And in my presentation, I want to focus on education for children with special educational needs. They are those who have a very severe and multiple disorders in development. And quite recently, these children were considered to be not prone for or not fit for education, but our experience, our practice of 100 years shows that teaching and education actually go ahead and they improve the level of development. And so kids with very severe and multiple disorders, they truly need education because that's an important factor of socialization, of inclusion and development. And when we speak about inclusion, we need to understand that the objective that we set is the inclusion in society as a result of our education. We want to make them, we want them to become active members of society, and learning, training, education take place in the environment with standard health co-students, fellows, peers, and then even that's a benefit for both sides. They normal standard children, standard development children, and children with special needs begin to complement each other. It is very important for the activity to be organized. It doesn't matter where that happens, in a special school or in a regular school. And there are many things are done on different levels for children with special needs and also for children with multiple and severe disorders. But I should say that there are many challenges, many problems that we have, and many societies, many countries run into these difficulties, and our society is not an exclusion. I will not cover all the challenges that we have, that we are facing, but first I want to mention some of them that are the most relevant for Russia nowadays. First, the classroom experience, which doesn't give an expected result for education of children with severe multiple disorders. Second, unpreparedness of specialists within educational institutions. Well, so home teaching that is usually offered for children with severe multiple disorders does not help them to achieve a desired level of community inclusion. Distance learning, that what we have now because of the lockdown situation and COVID pandemic, it became a negative factor for many kids, in particular for kids with multiple and severe disorders, and lack of partnership between kids and parents with disorders and the community and school. If we speak about lessons and classrooms, in 2016, new federal state educational standards were introduced for primary education for children with health limitations and for children with mental disabilities. So for children with multiple severe disorders, under the first and second standards, both the first and the second standard individual curriculum of development. It is a mandatory document which goes under the fourth standard option of standard number 1, or the second option for standard number 2. It has this special individual curriculum of development, has a plan, and the guidelines is the needs of the child. It is necessary to take special needs of the child into account. And that determines the structure and the content of individual curriculum. But what is important is that such curriculum is being developed together with the parents of such a student. Well, there's very serious challenges. In particular, we do not have enough regulating documents set by the Ministry of Education or from regional level. They are not enough to regulate the life and the learning process for children. But also what we need to keep in mind is the competences of teachers. The principle of learning while living should be implemented with account of the peculiarities of this category of students. It is extremely important for them to have not only the conventional system of classroom education, but it should be transformed into a system of learning in some special classes and also in some particular situations. When a child gets into the educational institution and starting with and ending with the time the child goes home after classes. So it is very important. It is extremely important to continuously assess the areas, immediate areas of development for the particular child. The teachers should also be capable of identifying the elements of these areas of development, and then the teacher should be registered, trained how to register even the minimum steps of progress of the child, and with account of this, make plans for the future to encourage this child for development. The second challenge that we quite often face in different regions is that teachers of regular schools and special schools are not prepared for teaching kids with multiple severe disabilities within the framework of schools. So what we need is to have continuous professional capacity building for such specialists. They need to learn how to work in multidisciplinary teams, because it's not just a single teacher who takes care of such a child. Often there are also speech therapists, psychologists, physical training, teacher of music, etc. They need to be capable of discussing things together in a team to have a custom-tailored curriculum for a particular kid, and to be clear about the expectations for this child. They must know how to work on a joint curriculum program for this child, including parents or caregivers of this child. they know how to make choices for this child, what suits best for such a child. I see that I'm running out of time, and we're close to the end of my presentation. It is extremely important for the work that being done for children should have their future life in society in mind. As a result of our work, the child, as a grown-up, should be included in society, in the community, and this work we should prepare this person for life, not excluded, but part of the community. Otherwise, it becomes unclear why we have invested so much time, effort, and finance for the child. We want him or her be independent, not get into some residential school or place. We want them to become part of the community. And thus, we need to think about our inclusive education in this context. We want to have a continuous way for development for these kids. Well, we are very well aware that they will not be totally independent for their whole life, but we want to make them more prepared to become part of the community. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much.
And I'm very willing to continue our dialogue.
Thank you so much. We're very grateful. I am particularly grateful. My son Charlie was in this category of complex disabilities. He was included in school starting at age 7. It was hard for me to get to that point. But when I say he had complex disabilities, what I mean is he used a wheelchair, he didn't speak, he didn't toilet himself, he didn't feed himself. And what he needed to learn in his educational process was how to trust other people, who he could trust, how to interact with other people, how to pay attention when important things were going forward. And therefore, full inclusion in the regular school was very important for me. And it very much led to his participation in community, just as the director has said, his ability to live in the community with other people. Being in school with all of the other children was a great preparation for that. We don't have laws in the United States that make that universally possible for all children with complex needs. It is difficult. And hopefully we can help each other move forward to a world where everyone has that opportunity. I want to point you to the bottom of your screen. There's a little face that says reactions. And if you wish to ask a question, you can go there and put your question into reactions, or turn on your video and raise your hand, or turn on your mic and ask a question. We have a few minutes for discussion among ourselves. We have many great questions that have been submitted already. Manos Antoninus had to leave from UNESCO, but he said he would happily answer questions by email. So if you have a question for him, please include your email address so that we can follow up with you and get the answer to you. Are there any current statements, questions, ideas? Did anyone have a brainstorm that solves the whole problem? Oh, and by the way, English speakers, we have made a solution for tomorrow. Perspectiva has made their office available to the English translator, who is very able, but who tomorrow will have better equipment so that we will not lose the mic. So you can look forward to that tomorrow. I don't speak Russian, so I don't see if there are any questions that have come up that are understandable by me. I did see a couple of questions before, and one that I thought was really interesting was, how do we manage the the transition from teachers who were trained in an old system to teachers who are trained now in a more inclusive and modern system. And that's a really important question. And I wonder if anyone, could you turn on your camera if you're willing to answer that question? I think that's one of the problems we have in schools is we train teachers in universal design for learning or new ideas or inclusive practice. And then they go into the school building and the teachers, the old teachers say, yeah, that's not the way we do it here. We tried it once and it doesn't work, or whatever. For me, it was having the courage to put Charlie into imperfect inclusion and allow his teachers, every year, his teachers said it was their best year in teaching. And that kind of message is really important. Jose, I see you making a comment. Did you want to answer? I am not seeing questions. Aha, now I have new questions. How and in what forms? Oh, I just asked that question. How do we manage the exchange of experience between teachers with experience and those without it? I think there may be people here who have experience with school environments and can talk a little bit about that. My experience as a parent was when you have one teacher who shows that it's possible to include a child with disability, it brings attention from the other teachers and they share ideas. My own school, I worked really hard to get Charlie into the inclusive class. And then that year, my school started to have inclusion meetings in the evening where we invited all of the other schools in Minneapolis to come and learn what we were doing and how it was working. We had so many requests for inclusive classrooms that we had to close down the special classroom and make sure that every classroom had an opportunity to have a child with a disability there, because it creates individual focus in a way that nothing else does. I see Svetlana may have an answer for us. You're on mute, Svetlana. Please go ahead.
Сью, спасибо большое. Ровно одну
Thank
минуту.
you very much, Sue. Just, this is a key issue, one of the most important issues. I think it will be able to pave the way to answer a lot of other questions connected with professional competencies of teachers and tutors. The development of high quality inclusive practice boils down to the competency of tutors and teachers. And of course, we need more investment into the educational system, from theory to practically oriented tutors, which is highly important, especially for primary, secondary schools, in order to be able to teach them methods of tutoring children with disabilities, and the program for such tutors, training for such tutors, the analysis of cases for teachers becomes the focus of specialized programs. We, of course, analyze the experience and we provide a scientific research of a particular area, prepare experts and teachers for particular schools, we assess their level of knowledge and competency. And this research allows us to lay the foundation for devising a program for a team of tutors and teachers in any particular school. And the third point is, which is also highly productive, is interdisciplinary cooperation and interaction of teachers. A team of teachers that receives a program work with psychologists, work with speech therapists, with tutors, with general tutors. So this interdisciplinary activity allows for teachers to learn from each other, to share experience, to form a method, to form a content that is important and necessary for each and every member of the team. And this, I suppose, is the complex way to decide this problem, to provide for a highly competitive team of teachers. And Elena Yureva has pointed out a certain aspect. We try to raise the professional competency of teachers at schools, and we actually really hope that parents will provide certain support, because parents know their children better than any teacher that comes into contact with the child. We hope that parents will be able to share their experience of their whole life and share their views with the teachers. So parents play a key role in that process.
Yes, clearly. And something we learn as parents is that our children experience belonging in our families. And we know what they look like when they're happy and when they're paying attention. And we would like to see schools take the same effort, not to wait for a research study or a system to be perfect, but rather to just keep their eye on the child and notice, is he happy? Is he paying attention? Is he in the classroom? I want to point out one study. I would be really not contributing. I point out the study that was made by Diane Rindack at the University of North Carolina on children with complex needs. And her research shows that terrible inclusion has better outcomes than very exquisite, highly planned, well-trained segregation. So when a child is educated in a separate environment by highly trained teachers with a lot of resources, the outcomes are still worse than if the child is just put into a regular classroom without much expert knowledge being there in the first place. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. It's a bit of a paradox. I have a comment here that I want to read. It may be necessary to consider not only interdisciplinarity, but also interdepartmental interaction. Since the Russian Federation of Disabled Persons is considered by since in the Russian Federation, a disabled person is considered by different executive authorities, and there is practically no interaction. Diane, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about interdepartmental collaboration. No person with a disability consists of parts. They are an integrated whole. And I think you have a major experience with interdepartmental collaboration for the benefit of people with disabilities. Are you with us?
Yes. I'm here. I'm here. Thank you, Sue. I think maybe it's helpful to think about how discussions of inclusion have evolved and how inclusive education is still being considered in some systems compared to others. I think that families of sons and daughters with intellectual disabilities can claim credit for being the ones to invent the concept of inclusive education. That, certainly when I was growing up, there would be no possibility of a child with an intellectual disability being in a regular school. In most communities where there was generally education available for most students. And I think that many of the specialties evolved around training of or educating children with different needs. As the concept of inclusion evolved, I think we started to recognize that inclusion is not a matter for special educators, it's a matter for educators. And so, whereas earlier, there were often a number of different, well, first of all, in many places within the former Soviet Union, ministries of education were not responsible for education of children with intellectual disabilities. It would have been a social ministry that had that responsibility. And that's still the case in many parts of the world. In other places, there are still separate departments responsible for educating children with disabilities apart from the regular system. And there are systems that are have specific responsibility for children with intellectual disabilities, children with autism, children who are deaf, children who are blind. And I think that what the GEM report that Manos described proves to us is that the way to have quality education is to have one system that serves everyone and to make sure that the needs of individual children are taken into account in that system. But you can't have inclusion if you have a department of curriculum and then the people responsible for educating children with intellectual disabilities have their own curriculum department and develop curriculum apart. So I think it's really critical that we start thinking about systemic reform where we really truly have one system responsible for all. Since I have the mic, I know we're running out of time, but I just want to build on something else that Svetlana said that I thought was really important in her comments, because she started to talk about transforming the language that's being used. And so much of the language, I realize that I'm getting the English translation. So the translation is not always true to the meaning in the original. But the language that Svetlana talked about moving away from is really very much a health model towards an education model. And as long as educating children with intellectual disabilities is still considered within an old medical model framework, then we're not going to get past the challenges that exist right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. That's really important. It's how we have to think about it. And tomorrow, I want to point out that there will be much more discussion about the defectology label and specialist and how that moves forward. Tomorrow we will hear about experiences from Russian and international teachers and specialists. So I hope you can be with us tomorrow. I hope you are making notes of the things that you wish you had had a chance to express today. I wish we had been in a room together and we could now have tea and talk at length about many of these brilliant insights from all of our speakers. Thank you so much to everyone. We will capture this chat and we will capture what you have said, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thank you again for being with us.